Dr. Mark L. Grover is a Latin American Studies bibliographer at the Harold B. Lee Library here at Brigham Young University. His interests include Brazil and Portugal, as well as social history. And he teaches Latin American Studies 495, which is the senior seminar course. I would imagine a number of you have taken that or will have the opportunity to do so. Dr. Grover was born and raised in Malad, Idaho, and is the father of 2 children. He received his PhD at Indiana University in 1985. He began working at Brigham Young University in 1973 on the library faculty. He has been responsible for collection development and reference for Latin America, the Iberian Peninsula, and Africa. He also teaches classes in Latin American Studies in contemporary Brazil, and Dr. Grover has lived in Brazil and Portugal. He has published several articles on library issues related to collections development and international librarianship. He has also published books and articles on social and religious history of Latin America, particularly Brazil. He is a member of several international organizations and in 1996 to 97 served as president of the Seminar on the Acquisition of Latin American Library Materials. Dr. Grover is consulted for the New York Public Library and the LDS Church. As a Portuguese speaker, I can say that para o mundo que fala português, aqui em nosso campus, Dr. Grover é o primeiro nome que a gente sempre ouve, and I'm very glad to have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Grover to you today. Thank you.
The speech is going to be in English, so don't worry. Very happy to be here. I've been on campus now for 30 years, and it is definitely a pleasure for me to be here, and I appreciate the chance to speak to the Kennedy Center. I'm a strong believer in the issues and that surround interdisciplinary studies on campus, and I'm very happy to be here. I may have a PhD, but I do not know how to run some of these things. So, 1926, just before leaving Argentina, Elder Melvin J. Ballard, after a 6 months mission and very few baptisms, made a prophecy about the growth of the church in South America. And he suggested that the growth would be similar to an oak tree, which begins slowly, but as a result of a strong foundation, then expands into a magnificent oak tree. This prophecy has seen partial fulfillment in the last 75 years. The first 25 years of the church in Latin America was very small and with limited growth. However, in the past 50 years, the church in Latin America has gone from less than 1% of the church to what it is now at about 37% of the entire church. More importantly, the percentage of the church, the percentage of the international church is primarily Latin American, with over 70% of the church being Latin American, if you take out the United States from that formula. So his suggestion that South America would be a power in the church is surely in the process of being fulfilled. My purpose of this presentation today is to give an overview of the growth of the development of the church in Latin America. It is my contention that the growth of the church in Latin America in the last half of this century is one of the most momentous events in the history of the church. Without this growth, the church would be very different than it is right now. Most of my presentation will be secular in nature, but I have described what I consider to be my spiritual view of this history in a chapter of a book called Out of Obscurity, and in a devotional address that I gave a year and a half ago, and I asked for those of you who are interested to look at those. I want you to know that I do believe that in the spiritual and the prophetic role of the evolution of the church, and that the hand of the Lord is in every aspect at all times in the process that has resulted in the development of the church in Latin America. In the 19th century, whenever missionaries went to Latin countries, they were always confronted with the same phenomena: a close relationship between church and the Catholic, between state and the Catholic Church. The result of that relationship was a secular protection of the position of the Catholic Church. So, as a result, the 19th century decision of the LDS Church to concentrate missionary work in the Protestant countries of Western Europe was an obvious consequence of this distinct church and state relationship in Latin America and in Southern Europe. and it was only when those restrictions were reduced or lifted that the LDS Church then expanded into Latin America, and that occurred primarily in the 20th century. There are three theological beliefs that greatly influenced the expansion of the church in Latin America. The first is the command to take the gospel to all the earth. The second, the declaration to Joseph Smith to send missionaries to the descendants of the Book of Mormon people, who are defined as the indigenous population of the Americas. Then that command has always been in the minds of the general authorities and leaders of the church. The only question was exactly when that would happen. The third that I'd like to expand on a little bit is a third that is not doctrinal, but is a belief that's been held by some of the early members of the church, primarily up until the 1950s, was the concept of the gathering of the descendants of Israel, but more specifically of the tribe of Ephraim. The foundation of that doctrine was fundamental in the teachings of Joseph Smith, but by the turn of the century, the 19th, 20th century, non-LDS ideas significantly influenced the interpretation of that doctrine up until the 1950s. Some of the leaders of the church embraced the writings and ideas of two secular movements called British Israelism and Anglo-Saxon Triumphalism. Though there are a number of aspects of these movements, the one generally accepted by some early leaders of the church was the belief that the populations of Northern Europe, particularly those of the Isles of the United Kingdom, had a high percentage of the direct descendants of the lost tribes of Israel, particularly the tribe of Ephraim. The literal descendants of Ephraim were liberally scattered throughout Western Europe and mixed with the ancestors of the Anglo-Saxon peoples. Consequently, the success of early missionaries in England and in Northern Europe, combined with the failure of missionary work in Southern Europe and Latin America, was explained by differences in the presence of the literal descendants of the tribe of Ephraim in the populations of the two regions. This modification in the concept of the gathering helped explain a downturn in church growth during the first part of the 20th century by suggesting that most of the gathering had occurred and that the activities of the missionaries was now that of finding the very few other descendants of the tribe of Ephraim who, for reasons of immigration, were found scattered throughout the world. When that had been accomplished, and just before the second coming, then the descendants of Lehi would accept the gospel. And I just want to read you a quote of a missionary during this time, Elder William Graham Bangerter, who was a missionary in the 40s and then became president of the mission in Brazil and eventually a general authority, stated this about his mission: "We thought that the blood of Israel meant blonde European people, and that we wouldn't expect too much success among Latin people because they probably didn't have the proper lineage. So under these conditions, we weren't too serious about the great overall purpose of missionary work in the church. And according to our vision, so was our success. We had very little of either." So these three doctrines then greatly influenced the expansion of the church in Latin America. Basically, there are 5 periods of expansion that I'm going to briefly go over. The first was in Mexico and was the result of two factors. The first was a desire by church leaders to find a place for colonies to be established. And so missionaries first went into Mexico to find a place for those colonies. And the second was to establish the church among the indigenous population, which occurred then basically in 1879 when the mission was established in Mexico under the direction of Elder Moses Thatcher. And the church has been in Mexico since that time, though struggled for many years due to political unrest. Second period then is in the 1920s in Argentina and Brazil, and was strongly influenced by this concept of gathering that I've just described. Wanting to send missionaries to South America, President Heber J. Grant approved a vacation trip of Andrew Jensen, the historian of the church, and asked that he make recommendations as to where missionaries should go. Andrew Jensen was a strong proponent of the concept of the literal gathering of Israel, and his suggestion was that the church go to the most European country in South America, that of Argentina. He was very impressed with Argentina, but not the rest of Latin America, particularly Brazil, nor the indigenous populations of South America. So a couple of years later, after he made recommendations to send missionaries to Argentina, and a couple of years later, when German immigrants then moved to Argentina and requested missionaries, Elder Melvin J. Ballard of the Quorum of the 70, of the Quorum of the 12, and 2 of the members of the Quorum of the 70 then came to Argentina and established the church. The work quickly moved from the German population, or this German group, to the larger Spanish and Italian population of the country. But the influence of the concept of the gathering from Northern Europe continued to be so strong that the second mission president to Argentina, who is that man right there, Reinhold Stuf, in reporting his mission in General Conference in 1936, felt that he had to justify teaching Spaniards and Italians and their descendants in Argentina by pointing out that there is historical evidence that some of the descendants of the 12 tribes probably went south and settled in Italy and Spain at the fall of the Roman Empire. So it was under his influence then that missionaries then went into Brazil in 1928. He was German, had just barely recently immigrated to the United States, and did not speak Spanish or Italian, and felt that his call was to go to the German peoples. And when he found that he couldn't do that in Argentina, he knew of a German population who had settled in southern Brazil in colonies and sent missionaries then in 1928. So the church was established then in German in southern Brazil and continued to be German until the early 1940s. Okay, the next period of time then, whoops, I blew that. Then was the period of expansion right after the war. This was generally influenced by the presence of American members in different countries. Frederick S. Williams in Uruguay, John O'Donnell in Guatemala, and Williams again in Peru, and another member in Chile. Then were able to persuade the general authorities to send missionaries into Argentina, which they did. Into those countries. The next period then is the 60s, and 1961 is a pivotal period in the history of the church in Latin America, particularly in South America. In that year, as part of a limited pilot program to have general authorities live away from Salt Lake City, Elder A. Theodore Tuttle, a newly young called missionary, a member of the First Quorum of the 70, moved to Montevideo, Uruguay to direct the missions of South America. By that time, almost all the remnants of this specialized doctrine of the gathering of Northern Europeans was gone. And he then began a process that would strengthen the church and bring it to the level of development that it had occurred through the rest of the world. Part of his plan then was to expand the church throughout the rest of South America and focus church efforts on the native populations of Latin America, which had not been occurring up to that time. So during the last 2 years of his mission, which is 64 and 65, and then right after, then the church had then expanded to all the rest of the countries of Latin America. So by 1966, then the church was in all of those areas, with the exception of the Afro-Latin countries of the Caribbean and South America. Then the final period is after 1978, after the priesthood revelation, in which then after that missionaries were sent to the rest of the Latin America, primarily the Caribbean, and had fairly good success in the Dominican Republic and Haiti, though not in the English-speaking Caribbean. So, since the 1960s, then the growth in the church has been phenomenal. By the end of 2001, the total membership of the church was 4,169,000, as compared to 45,000 when Elder Tuttle went to Uruguay. So that's an incredible growth. A comparison with the rest of the world shows you what the effect that's had. 6 of the top 10 countries in terms of population of the church are in Latin America, with Mexico, Brazil, and Chile directly after the United States. But notice that obviously the population of the United States is so large. But then the Philippines, and then 3 countries, Peru, Argentina, and Guatemala. Then of the next 10, so the bottom 10, then you have another 6 of the 10 countries. So 12 of the top 20 countries of the world, then, in terms of numbers are from Latin America, and you can see those figures. The importance of this has been this growth has suggested that in the past few years there might have begun what is called the Latin Americanization of the church, of a church that was almost exclusively 30 years earlier, a North American European church. However, due to the large numbers that are in the United States, that really isn't true. just because of the large numbers, and that will continue to be in the United States. But for the international church, there has been a Latin Americanization, without a doubt, of the international church. What I decided to do was project a growth of the church in Latin America based on the last 10 years of growth. And what we see that if growth continues in Latin America as it has been doing, then by the year, somewhere between the year 2015 and 2020, then the church in Latin America will be over 50% of the church. The growth in Latin America has been fairly consistent, was fairly consistent in the 1960s. If we look at growth of the church in Latin America from 60 on, what you see is a fairly consistent growth. There are periods of where there's something has happened a little bit there. 1976, 1984, and probably 87. You can see those kind of bounces, but it's been fairly consistent. There's not been a big. It's a big jump if you look at the numbers, but it's not significant in terms something that would jump out at you and say this is something really happened in that time. But the real growth then really occurred in the 1980s. As you look at that, that's where the growth was really occurring. It was during the 1980s that the percentage of the church in Latin America, the percentage that's in the church in Latin America doubled in comparison to the rest of the church. Growth occurred in all of Latin America, but during this period, but the three countries where growth was most significant were in these three countries: Brazil, Chile, and Mexico. You can see the differences in growth, in these three countries, but all three are moving up very quickly. In the last few years, Mexico was growing faster than the rest of the countries, but in the last few years that's changed, and Brazil has been growing in the last 10 years 15% per year, whereas Mexico has been growing just 7%. And so what you see then, if it continues, is that the number of members in Brazil will surpass Mexico in about 3 years, 2005, 2006. Now you can see this growth. If you include two other countries of Latin America into that chart, what you see is a lesser growth, particularly in the smaller of Uruguay or Argentina, growing, but you don't have of growth that occurs. The question is, and I've looked at that, and there's something happens right there in 1984. The question is, what happened in '84? There's two things. Externally, many of the countries in Latin America changed from a military dictatorship to a democratic government between '83 and '88, with Argentina in '83 and Chile in '88. Now, what the effect that has is a releasing of freedom, oftentimes, and there's several economic and social changes that occur, but it's almost a psychological change that once the military dictatorship is over, there's a feeling of freedom that occurred. This is particularly true, I think, in Brazil and Chile. But I think a more realistic reason for this would be an internal change, which I consider to be one of the most significant organizational events of the LDS Church in the 20th century. On June 24th of 1984, the Church announced the organization of 13 area presidencies, each made up of 3 general authorities. The 3 presidencies assigned to Latin America, all general authorities lived in the region much the way Elder Tuttle had lived in Montevideo in 1961. Now, there are a lot of results of that significant change. The most significant being a decentralization of a lot of decisions from Salt Lake City. But in terms of growth, what happened was a centralization of missionary work to these regions. There was a greater amount of contact with general authorities by mission presidents and missionaries. Most of these areas had a general authority supervisor, but one. Now you've got 3, and you've got all of the bureaucracy that's involved with an area presidency. So there was greater attention given to mission presidents by area presidents. There was a lot of goal setting this time. There was, in fact, competition, I think, between mission area presidents would come home and say, so-and-so's baptizing, and so there became competition between these area regions. And what you see then is that tremendous growth then in the 1980s. And I think that's probably the most significant reason for that growth. Now, if you look at the present growth of the church in all of the countries of Latin America, you see one thing that happens in terms of potential growth. And what I decided here was to put down a list of the population of each of the countries of Latin America, the church's population, and then look at the percentage of the church in that country. And I've arranged them from the least percent to the highest percent. So notice here that you have in the bottom 10 countries, Brazil number 3 and Mexico number 10, who have the largest number of members, still only are very small percentages. Brazil's only less than 0.5% of the entire population. Mexico, where the church has been there for as long as it has, still is less than 1% of the population. And so notice the size of these countries. The large Colombia, Venezuela, Brazil's the largest, Mexico's the second, 37. The larger countries tend to have a lower percentage of the church population who are members. Now let me show you the end of the chart, the bottom of the chart. And what you see is that of the larger countries in Latin America, there's only one country, Peru, that has over 1% of its population which are members of the country. Now notice down here, these 3 countries down here, 3 or 4. You've got Chile, which is 3.6% of the population, Uruguay 2.3%, and Honduras 1.6%, and even Guatemala. Notice how small those countries are, even Chile. Okay, so what you have is the question is there tends to be a higher percent of the population who is than in small countries there are in the countries. My contention is probably due to the fact of the number of countries, and I'm going to talk about that. Factors involved is why growth tends to be very important. Has not been published since the 1990s. Equally test that theory, but I number of missions per country, and so I surmise in very broad terms the number of missionaries per mission 150, and that varies up and down. And I realize that I'm on thin ice here, but let's surmise that that's true. Okay, if we do that, now what I have then is the population, the number of missionaries, percentage which I've got there. What I did is if there's 150 missionaries per mission, then what I did is I compared that number with the country's population, and basically I'm able to say that in Colombia there's basically one missionary for every 71,000 members in the population in the country. Now I realize I'm in trouble, but we're going to do it anyway. Okay, what you look here, what you see is that your largest countries then have the least number of missionaries per population in the country. Even though both Brazil and Mexico have the largest number of members, in terms of population, they're still small. So what you have there then, except for Nicaragua, which jumps in there, and there's a reason for that, your larger countries have less missionaries per population. Just to give you an example, Brazil has 26 missionaries, Chile has 8. But the population is different, 172 million. And here's the bottom of the chart. Chile has 14 million, 8 missions. If Brazil had the same number of missionaries per population as Chile has, Brazil would have 96 missionaries right now. And Mexico would have up in that same number. Missions, excuse me. No, yeah, missions, 98 missions. Okay. So what's happening then is that we're sending more missionaries to the smaller countries who then in turn are able to baptize, and so that what we're having is, notice this, in terms of the number of missionaries per person, the 3 lowest ones are also the 3 highest ones in terms of percentage of the population. So I surmise then that the number of missionaries then is directly related to the number that are being baptized. And now the question is, why does that happen? I'm really not sure why certain missions are opened, but when a mission is opened, they always expand the number of missionaries to be about the same number, between 100 and 150. So that if you open a mission like they just did a few years ago in Uruguay, you had 150 missionaries, you open a second mission, you increase that number to close to 300 missionaries. The number of missionaries in the country tend to baptize basically the same number, so you increase the number that are being baptized, and it's kind of a rolling effect. And I think when the decision comes to be made, we have 26 missions in Brazil who are baptizing at a certain rate, and we have a mission, and mission in Honduras is baptizing at the same rate, but there's one mission there. Where do we add an additional mission? I think just maybe psychologically you add it in Honduras because missions tend to be oftentimes geographic as well as they are numbers. But the result is then that your smaller countries tend to have a lot higher number of missionaries. Okay, one final thing on the growth is what's happened in the last few years. And I just want to show you a chart of percentage of growth in Brazil, Chile, Mexico, then Latin America, then the entire church. Now what you see here is the 80s. It is bouncing around all over. I mean, you've got Brazil going up to 60% growth one year, dropping way down to just above 20. Mexico doing the same. But isn't that an interesting part? That's the 80s. This is the 90s right there as they tend to come together, and this is the year 2000 right there. What you've had is a significant drop in the percentage of growth. Now that's not a drop in the number of members. It's a drop in percentage. But it's coming down basically then to be equal. Brazil, Chile, Mexico, and the entire church is there. Now, there are external factors, but really it's the internal factor that has created that, and that is the concern of President Hinckley and the leadership of the church over the high rate of baptisms and low rate of retention. And Chile has received more than its share of concern over this, including the presence of an apostle there right now. But I just want to show you this is their growth during that same time period. In April of 1999, President Hinckley came to Chile and he delivered a powerful message to missionaries to focus on retention as well as a number of baptisms. Quote, "The days are past, the days are gone, the days are no longer here when we will baptize hundreds of thousands of people in Chile and then they will drift away from the church." Further on he says, "When you begin to count those who are not active, you are almost driven to tears over the terrible losses we have suffered in this nation." And then he ends his speech like this: "Now I am sure you have understood my message. I have stated it as plainly as I know." And the result of that, one missionary told me, was a dropping in one mission from 900 baptisms to 90 baptisms in the month after he gave that talk. So, and the focus on going back and getting those people that have been baptized who are inactive. The interesting thing is, and I don't have a chart on this, is that the growth of the church in general without Latin America has not followed this type of high and low. It's basically, the last few years has basically been about 2.5%. That's outside the church without the figures from Latin America. So most of this huge growth and then the lowering of growth during that time period occurred because of the Latin America. Now, why the growth in Latin America? Determining that is a real challenge. A number of explanations have been given and suggested in the literature. As I examine the variety of theories, I strongly suggest that any attempt to focus on one reason is a mistake. It's a lot of different reasons coming together. I'll very briefly suggest some secular occurrences that I believe is resulting in the growth of the LDS Church. And please recognize that I'm speaking in very general terms and that there will always be exceptions to what I'm saying. The entire world in the past 50 years has experienced phenomenal economic and social changes, but more than any other part of the world, Latin America has experienced a greater level of changes. At the end of the Second World War, Latin America was still a feudalistic and rural society that continued to exhibit economic and social structures based on the export of raw materials and traditional patrimonial political control. When economic changes began to occur, such as industrialization and modernization of farming, the result was a serious disruption of the social structure of the rural areas. Europe and America have gone through similar changes, but there was a much more natural process of development, so that the social changes in these countries were easier to absorb and thus did not result in the social disruption that's happened in Latin America. And just as an example, let's look at just urbanization. What you had during these periods, this is from 65 to 85, is a significant move from rural to urban areas. And what happened is that these immigrants, for whatever reason, started to come to the cities, the larger cities, Mexico City, Lima, Peru, Sao Paulo, Buenos Aires, and they came in huge numbers. At one time, I figured there were 40,000 immigrants arriving in the city of Sao Paulo every day during this time. So it's a huge change that's occurring. These people generally moved into the lower class areas, the slums as we would call them, and although they oftentimes stayed there for just a short time or expanded into growing areas, they still stayed there. The importance of this is that when they were in the rural areas, they tended to be in a controlled traditional structure and system. They had a patron, they had a church that was interested in them, or was there anyway. They knew they had relationships. They had family, and there were no there was no competition to this structure. So when they needed help, they went to family, they went to the church, they went to the patron. When they leave that system and they go to the cities, they're left alone. Their family, for the most part, is gone. They don't know who the church is. They don't have anybody who can take care of them. So they often, struggling in this environment, would turn to organizations that seemed willing to help them. And as every missionary who's been to Latin America knows who those organizations are, they tended to be the evangelical churches who were building small churches or renting homes in these areas, and oftentimes these immigrants then went to those groups. Now the LDS Church has had limited success with this population, but our success has been a byproduct of a psychological transformation in society that slowly began to occur because of these major economic and social factors that began primarily with the migrants. Most traditional societies, especially Catholic countries, historically have had strong connections between religion and culture. This relationship is often so strong that when a person states that they are Brazilian, they're also suggesting that to be such involves identifying with Catholic beliefs. Not being a Catholic would be considered paramount to rejection of being a Brazilian. In this cultural situation, a change in religion is much more than the acceptance of a different set of religious beliefs. It is a rejection of your family, your country, and your past. Now, what's happened in Latin America over the past 30 years is the creation of an environment in which there is a separation of religion from culture and nationality that has just barely begun to occur. That change began first with the migrants in the large urban areas, but has expanded to the rest of the society. In this type of an environment, the religious foundation that was part of the past and supported the past becomes less important. So when spiritual needs develop within a Latin American, regardless of their social class, the pressure to seek answers only from the traditional is lessened because the relationship between traditional religion and society is less and less compatible. We need to be very careful not to emphasize this separation too much. The relationship of the Catholic Church and Latin American culture continues to be very strong and felt by many. There are still formidable cultural pressures in Latin America to remain Catholic. However, the fact that almost 20 to 30% of the population of Latin America has left the Catholic Church and gone to other churches over the past 30 to 40 years is an indication of a major psychological shift in the religious foundation of the region. Though these economic, social, and psychological changes are compelling factors that help us to understand the changing religious environment in Latin America, it is important not to place too much emphasis on these secular reasons. The disruption of society creates a larger pool of a population who is susceptible to religious change, but it does not mean that religious change will occur. All people, rich and poor, go through times in their lives in which there is a need for spiritual assistance. And if they do not find that help in the institutions and relationships that are currently part of their lives, it is possible that spiritual help will be sought in other areas. For the most part, people making decisions on religion, they make their decisions on religion based not on social or economic needs, but for reasons of the Spirit. And I think that's very, very important. Even though these factors are there, and they're creating a pool of people who potentially could change, people do not make decisions on religion based on economic factors. They have a need they have spiritual needs, and that's why they make changes in religion. Most of the fastest growing alternative religions in Latin America manifest a greater perception of a connection with deity. In other words, you can feel the relationship with God in some of these churches much more than you do in the Catholic Church, and for that matter, our church, the LDS Church. The result then is that in Latin America there has been created a large pool of persons who are susceptible to religious change in a society in which the act of religious change has become acceptable and in some cases even encouraged. But that fact alone does not mean that the LDS Church will grow. There's an amazing amount of competition for potential converts in Latin America from all churches, and there are major players involved, much more than us, primarily in the form of evangelical churches. The the religious environment that exists in Latin America could easily be compared to the religious environment of competition that existed in 19th century New York, when Joseph Smith found himself to be among a pool of potential converts to a large number of religions. In Latin America, that pool is very large, and there are a lot of churches, and some of them are small, some of them are large. I've tried to I'm interested in tracking that growth. It's very hard because statistics aren't available. There is one book that does publish statistics called Operation World. It's available in book form or in CD form. And I have limited faith in their numbers because they're not tracking the fastest growing. It's impossible. But I decided to compare what they have with ours. So I went and did randomly selected 180 churches in Latin America, of which they have statistics for, and then compared growth between 1900 and 20. These are the churches in Brazil, so you can see who got picked up. The Congregação Cristã do Brasil is a big one, obviously. The bottom one, the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Igreja Universal is of course the big one. And their numbers, by the way, are significantly lower than what they've been suggested. What I did then is I put them together and I put percentages of growth, so that here you have the Protestant churches on this line, LDS church growth, percentage of growth during 1920, and then the differences. And I just went from, anyway, what it is you've got here, basically we're growing about 8% higher, if you can see that, than the rest of, than the churches in Latin America. And you've got, this is the lower end of the chart, so that you've got percentage of growth. For example, in Venezuela, we're much lower percentage growth than we are the Protestants. But anyway, basically, that's just kind of a feel for how we're growing. I decided also to check and see how we did in comparison to churches that are similar to us, are suggested to be similar to us, and that's Jehovah's Witnesses and Seventh-day Adventists. And you can see that during this 10-year period, the Jehovah's Witnesses were a little bit higher than we were, and the Seventh-day Adventists were a little bit lower. So basically, we're fairly close, but not the major players in the growth of the church. What's important to recognize is that when you have all of these things happening, there's also things happening within the church that results in growth. And I don't have time. I had two examples. I'm going to miss those, but one is the priesthood revelation in Brazil, which basically opened up growth of the church in Brazil, and you can see what happened. And the second one is just changes in perception of missionaries. But I do want to focus on one, and that is the role of missionaries, which I've talked about before. Basically, the more missionaries you have in a country, the faster it grows. This is a chart then that shows a distribution of missionaries from 30 to 1970 according to areas of the world. And what you can see down here then is the Latin American countries, which are very slow, and they start to grow. Here's the United States, here's Europe, and then there's Asia. Basically, missionaries even up into the 70s are primarily sent to Europe and to the United States and Canada. So without missionaries, you don't grow. That's basically what I'm saying. Okay, an example, I want to give you an example of what happens, how increasing the number of missionaries affects the growth can be seen in Uruguay. The church was established in Argentina and Brazil. 1947, then they opened a mission in Uruguay and put then basically the same number of missionaries. President Williams, Frederick S. Williams, then sent missionaries throughout the entire country of Uruguay. Uruguay is a small country. 40% live in the city of Montevideo, and the rest live in small cities. Right now, those cities, the largest I think is still only 100,000 people. But by sending 4 to 6 missionaries into a city of less than 30,000, the Mormon presence became very, very significant. By comparison, Brazil, we weren't sending missionaries into cities of less than 100,000 up until the 1980s, but in Uruguay they were in these very small cities. So the Mormon presence in Uruguay became very significant. Let me just show you. Here's an example. Here's a chart of the missionaries that we sent. If You notice here in 1948 to 1953, they basically come down to a point, and then they almost mirror each other in terms of the three countries. So that up until 1959, 57, 58, then the number of missionaries in these three countries are the same. What happens is that you form a new mission right there in 1959. And so the number of missionaries in Brazil shoots up, and then you form another mission in 1968. So you can see the number of missionaries are growing. In Argentina, it looks like they were preparing for missionaries, for a new mission, because they increasingly sent missionaries. But then in Argentina in 1962 is when the new mission was formed. What happens with Uruguay is that it gets up to that point, it stays at there. So you've got the growth in the missionaries, and you've got the growth staying the same in Uruguay. Okay, if you look at membership in these countries during the same period, you see the same thing happening. Similar number of members in Uruguay in these three countries until 1958. At that point, Brazil shoots up, and Argentina and Uruguay stay about the same until the new mission is established, which is 62, and then Argentina starts to shoot up higher, and Uruguay stays the same. So the number of missionaries then greatly affects, in a country greatly affects the growth of the church. So what you've got then is you've got an increasing, the external factors are increasing the number of people who are potential members of the church, and then the church changes certain things, so we begin to send more missionaries into Latin America, and the growth occurs. I want to spend just a few minutes on retention, and then I'll be finished. Retention has been a problem in the church for a long time, and it's an issue that we've been talking about for a long time. It's something that scholars have recognized for a long time, and they have not been kind. In fact, they've suggested that we've been making fraudulent claims in terms of numbers, because they would see who was attending and see our numbers. But there's two things that need to be important. We as the LDS Church determine membership different than other churches in Latin America. We determine membership by who is baptized and who isn't taken off the rolls through excommunication or other reasons. So it's very hard to get your name taken off the roll in the LDS Church. Other churches tend to because they don't have the sophisticated international system of accounting, then their numbers tend to be created locally by pastors who go out, identify those who have been baptized, those who are attending the church, or in some way identify their preference to the church. So in most of the churches, and their membership records deal with those who are attending. Ours deal with those who've been baptized. Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, you're not considered a member unless you actually do missionary work. So, okay, so that's important. The second thing is that we count differently than everybody else. The second thing is the difficulty in conversion, and I don't know. I've watched in Brazil as friends that I've had have gone through ups and downs in their relationship to the church. Some have stayed active, some have been excommunicated, joined other churches, come back, been rebaptized, in activity, etc., etc. Even during periods of inactivity, they all tended to have positive feelings towards the church. Being a dedicated member of the church is difficult. In the 19th century, it meant leaving your country and coming to the United States. In the 20th century, it means staying there and confronting family members and friends who continually give you pressure to give up the church. And anything that happens in the United States affects the membership worldwide, as happened last week with the abduction of Elizabeth Smart and all of the revelations that came out. I can assure you that members of the church throughout the world are feeling pressure from friends because of things that are being published. So it's hard to be a dedicated member. The third thing is what is happening in the LDS Church in South America or Latin America is not that unusual. Evangelical churches have low attendance. New converts come in and out. Nor is what is happening in Latin America that different from anywhere else in the LDS Church elsewhere. European member retention is basically about the same as it is in Europe. Asian retention is somewhat similar. Even in Utah, we struggle with retention. If you think about it, in the 3 wards I've lived in while I've been here in Utah, seldom have we gone up above 60%, generally between 50 to 60% attendance in sacrament meetings. What that means is there's 40% who under pressure of home teachers, family members, bishops, on and on and on, still remain inactive in the church. we still only have that percentage. So it is very hard to remain in the church, and so what's happening in Latin America isn't that different from what's happening. Although the percentages are a little bit lower, it's still happening. Let's see. Now, what I decided to do was just to do a distribution of church organizations. So what I did is I did percentage of the church membership for U.S., Asia, European, and you're in Latin America. So here's about 37% right there. So there's the membership. If in this line, if everything's fairly equal, should basically be about the same as it goes across. Here's the percentage of stakes, just a little bit lower. And stakes are organized based on about the same number of members. Here's the number of districts, a little bit higher because it's in the mission field. Here's the number of missions, about the same. Here's the number of temples, a little bit lower, but still fairly close to the percentage of membership. The only figure, and I threw this in, I don't know why I threw it in, is the number of general authorities. There are 9 general authorities born in Latin America. Actually, 3 of those are actually left Latin America because they're Anglo-Americans. So there's 6. So the highest percentage of general authorities is obviously from the United States and Canada. So that's the only one. Everything else tends to be the same. So Latin America is pretty close. What I want to do is close by quoting a general authority. This time going to be Hinckley in a regional conference given in Venezuela on August 3rd, 1999. That's what he said. Where there are now hundreds of thousands, there will be millions, and our people will be recognized for the goodness of their lives, and they will be respected and honored and upheld. We shall build meeting houses, more and more of them, to accommodate their needs, and we shall build temples in which they may receive their sacred ordinances and extend those blessings to those who have gone beyond the veil of death. Now, what I would suggest then from this is that we can only surmise from this prediction that what has happened in Latin America during the past 50 years is just the beginning of the growth and development of the church in Latin America. Thank you. Not too much. If there are any questions, most of you need to leave. I know the time's gone, but I'd be happy to answer any questions. Yes? The question was, do I know of any statistics with regards to the Perpetual Education Fund in Latin America? And I don't have any. There have been published. I know that they started slow. They started in Chile and Mexico, but they have expanded to most of Latin America. So.